The morning sun barely penetrated the tall windows of courtroom 304 in the Philadelphia County Courthouse. It was 9:30 a.m. on a cold Tuesday morning, and Judge Marcus Sterling adjusted his black robe as he prepared for another day of cases. At 62 years old, with gray hair and tired eyes, he had spent 25 years on the bench, believing he had seen it all. The courthouse buzzed with its usual morning activities. Clerks rushed through the marble hallways with stacks of papers, while lawyers in expensive suits whispered to their clients. The wooden benches in the courtroom were filled with people waiting for their cases to be called. Sarah Chen, Judge Sterling's clerk for the past 3 years, organized the day's files on his desk. She paused when she reached one particular case, frowning slightly as she noticed something. Before she could mention it, Judge Sterling waved her away. "Let's get started," he said, his voice carrying the weight of authority he had cultivated over decades. The first few cases moved quickly, typical morning matters of traffic violations and minor offenses. Judge Sterling handled them with mechanical efficiency, barely looking up from his papers. His reputation for being strict, especially with certain defendants, was well known throughout the Philadelphia legal community, though no one dared to openly discuss it. At 10:45 a.m., Sarah called out the next case. Docket number 2024-CR-789, Commonwealth versus Dr. Maya Washington. A woman rose from the back of the courtroom. Dr. Maya Washington walked forward with quiet dignity, her steps measured and calm. She wore a navy blue business suit, her natural hair neatly styled, and carried herself with the composure of someone used to high-pressure situations. At 42 years old, she had the kind of presence that usually commanded respect in any room she entered. But Judge Sterling barely looked up. He shuffled through the papers, his reading glasses perched on the tip of his nose. The charge was a traffic violation that had escalated after a series of unfortunate events. A missed court date due to an emergency surgery she had to perform, followed by a misunderstanding with a police officer. "Your Honor," began Thomas Reed, Dr. Washington's attorney, "my client is a respected neurosurgeon at Philadelphia General Hospital. The missed court date was due to an emergency operation that couldn't wait. We have documentation." Judge Sterling cut him off with a wave of his hand. "The facts are simple, Counselor. Your client failed to appear for a court date and then argued with an officer of the law when he attempted to serve the bench warrant." Dr. Washington stood straight, her hands clasped in front of her. She had spent the last 18 hours performing 2 back-to-back brain surgeries, saving both patients' lives, before coming directly to court. Dark circles under her eyes hinted at her exhaustion, but her voice remained steady. "Your Honor, if I may explain," she started. Judge Sterling's sharp glance silenced her. "The time for explanations was at your original court date, Ms. Washington," he said, emphasizing Ms., while ignoring her professional title. The corner of his mouth twitched downward as he looked at the file again. In the gallery, several lawyers who had finished their own cases stayed to watch. They exchanged knowing looks. Judge Sterling's patterns were familiar to anyone who spent time in his courtroom. Sarah Chen shifted uncomfortably at her desk, her fingers hovering over her keyboard. She had noticed something in Dr. Washington's file, something important, but the judge's dismissive attitude made her hesitate to speak up. The tension in the courtroom grew thicker as Judge Sterling began his lecture. "This court's time is valuable, Miss Washington. Your disregard for the law and subsequent behavior toward law enforcement shows a pattern of disrespect for our legal system." Dr. Washington remained composed, though her attorney looked increasingly concerned. The original traffic violation, a disputed right turn at a yellow light, had somehow snowballed into something much more serious. Sarah finally gathered her courage and began writing a note. She knew what was coming next. She had seen it too many times before. But this time, something was different. This time, she knew something the judge didn't. As Judge Sterling prepared to announce his sentence, the morning sun finally broke through the clouds outside, casting long shadows across the courtroom floor. No one in the room, least of all Judge Sterling himself, realized that the next few moments would change everything. Judge Sterling cleared his throat, leaning forward in his high-backed chair. The fluorescent lights of courtroom 304 buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across his stern face. Dr. Maya Washington stood perfectly still, her exhaustion from 18 hours of surgery hidden behind a mask of professional dignity. "Miss Washington," Judge Sterling began, deliberately ignoring her title again, "this court cannot function when individuals choose to disregard its authority." His voice carried through the now silent courtroom, where even the usual shuffling of papers had stopped. Sarah Chen's hand trembled slightly as she scribbled her note. She knew she had to act fast, but years of courtroom protocol made her hesitate. Interrupting a judge during sentencing was almost unheard of. "Your original violation was minor," Judge Sterling continued, his tone growing harder with each word. "But your subsequent actions show a troubling disrespect for law enforcement and this court." He paused, looking down at Dr. Washington over his reading glasses. The gallery had grown unusually full. Word had spread through the courthouse about what was happening in courtroom 304, and several lawyers and court staff found reasons to linger. They'd seen this pattern before, what started as a simple traffic ticket turning into something much more serious. "This court sentences you to 30 days in county jail," Judge Sterling announced, causing a collective gasp from the gallery, "plus a fine of $5,000. "Your Honor!" Sarah Chen's voice cut through the courtroom like a thunderbolt. In her 15 years as a court clerk, she had never interrupted a judge. Her hands shook as she rushed forward with her note, nearly tripping over her sensible shoes. Judge Sterling turned to her, his face flushing red at the interruption. "Miss Chen, what is the meaning of—" But Sarah had already placed the note in front of him. Her usual neat handwriting was rushed and urgent. Dr. Maya Washington, Chief of Neurosurgery at Philadelphia General, saved Emma's life last October. Your granddaughter's emergency surgery. The color drained from Judge Sterling's face as he read the note. His hands, usually so steady, began to tremble slightly. He looked up at Dr. Washington, really seeing her for the first time that morning. Memories flooded back. His 16-year-old granddaughter Emma, the terrifying phone call about her collapse at soccer practice, the desperate hours in the hospital waiting room. He remembered the surgeon who had walked out at 3 a.m., still in her scrubs, to tell them Emma would make a full recovery. The same surgeon who now stood before him in his courtroom. Dr. Washington, he said softly, her proper title finally finding its way to his lips. The change in his tone made everyone in the courtroom lean forward slightly. Dr. Washington met his gaze steadily. "Yes, Your Honor. I remember Emma well. She had an arteriovenous malformation, a type of brain bleed. She's doing very well in her follow-up appointments." The silence in the courtroom grew heavy. Judge Sterling's hands moved to remove his reading glasses, revealing eyes that suddenly looked older and more troubled. The familiar walls of his prejudices began to crack, letting in uncomfortable rays of truth. Sarah Chen stepped back to her desk, her heart pounding. In the gallery, the watching lawyers exchanged meaningful glances. They all knew they were witnessing something extraordinary, a moment when justice, true justice, hung in the balance. Judge Sterling looked down at his sentencing notes, then back at Dr. Washington. His next words would either acknowledge his mistake or cement his prejudice. The weight of the moment pressed down on everyone in courtroom 304 as heavily as the morning air before a storm.